Space doesn't care about muscle. It doesn't respect a square jaw or a perfect physical fitness score. When the Cryan High Command demanded bodies for the meat grinder of Sector 4, they looked for warriors. Captain Maddox chose differently. He passed over the super soldiers, the heavy worlders, the genetically modified titans. He pointed a four-fingered claw at a coughing Knockney recruit named Tobias Quinn. Everyone laughed. They stopped laughing when Quinn was the only one who walked back out. The recruitment deck of Orbital Station Charlie 9 smelled of burnt ozone and industrial floor cleaner. It was a sterile, unforgiving scent that clung to the back of the throat. Lined up along the bulkhead were 30 human recruits. They were the absolute apex of their species. Genetically screened, chemically enhanced, and trained since adolescence to fight wars they barely understood, for a coalition that barely cared they existed. Captain Maddox walked the line. Maddox was Cran. Towering at 7 feet, his carapace was a mottled charcoal gray scarred by a dozen atmospheric drops and 100 close quarters engagements. His species found the phonetic gymnastics of human languages inefficient. Snorts, so he had adopted a tan moniker to smooth over operational logistics. Maddox was easy for human tongues. It also happened to be the name of the first human he had ever seen die. A reminder, his four-digited claws clicked softly behind his back as he inspected the meat. "'Tis Batch's prime, Captain, Lieutenant," Hayes said, trailing half a step behind Maddox. Hayes was a liaison, a corporate suit, dressed in a military uniform. He sweated under the station's harsh fluorescent lights. "We pulled them from the heavy gravity colonies on Reach. Look at the bone density readouts. You drop these boys on a hostile world. They don't just survive. They conquer." Maddox paused in front of a recruit built like a main battle tank. The name tape reg. The man's neck was thicker than Maddox's thigh. His eyes were cold, professional, staring a hole through the bulkhead. Opposite him, heavy worlder, Maddox buzzed, his translation collar turning his native clicks into synthesized English. High caloric requirement, elevated oxygen consumption. What happens when the supply lines fail, Lieutenant? They carry enough rations for 2 weeks, Hayes countered quickly. And they don't fail. We bred them for endurance. Maddox grunted a sound like grinding stones and moved on. He passed a sharpshooter named Cole whose neural jack implants gleamed silver at his temples. He passed a brawler named Wyatt whose knuckles were flattened out from years of bare-knuckle pit fighting. They were all impressive. They were all weapons. They were all perfectly calibrated for a sterile, predictable battlefield. Sector 4 was neither. Maddox reached the end of the line. The 31st recruit wasn't supposed to be there. He was a clerical error. A logistical oversight dragged in from a transport ship that had docked at the wrong umbilical. His name tape read Tobias Quinn. He was 5 feet 9 inches. He had a Slight stoop to his shoulders, the kind developed from years spent in confined spaces. His skin was pale, carrying the sickly pore of a man who hadn't seen natural sunlight in a decade. A faint wee accompanied his breathing. A rattling sound deep in his chest. He looked exhausted. He looked like a stiff breeze would snap him in half. And this one? Maddox asked, stopping squarely in front of Tobias. Lieutenant. Hayes checked his data pad, his face flushing violently. A mistake, Captain. My apologies. He's a deep belt miner. Got swept up in the draft sweep on Ceres. We're shipping him back down to maintenance. He barely passed the baseline physical. Tobias didn't flinch. He didn't lock his knees and puff out his chest like Jackson. He just stood there, his eyes drifting lazily over Maddox's segmented armor. He looked at the alien captain, not with awe or terror, but with the exhausted indifference of a man calculating how long his current shift was going to last. Miner, Maddox said. Ceres belt. 15 years, Tobias said. His voice was growly, dry. He didn't add a sir. The atmospheric scrubbers on Ceres are outdated. Maddox noted. They're garbage. Tobias corrected. You breathe through your teeth to catch the rust flakes. Why didn't you request a transfer? Pays good and the rocks don't care if you complain. You just dig. Maddox stared down at the human. He analyzed the slight tremor in Tobias's hands. Not fear, nerve damage. Prolonged exposure to heavy vibratory equipment. He looked at his boots, scuffed, resoled. Wrapped in a layer of thermal tape to seal a microfracturer. The heavy worlders down the line had pristine factory new gear. They trusted their equipment implicitly. Tobias Quinn clearly trusted nothing. I need 4. For the recon drop onto Tartarus 9. Maddox announced, his synthesized voice echoing down the metal corridor. Hayes smiled in relief. Excellent. Jackson, Cole, Wyatt. Jackson, Cole, Wyatt, Maddox interrupted, turning his massive domed head back to the liaison. He pointed a long serrated claw directly at the scrawny miner at the end of the line. And Quinn, silence dropped over the deck. Like a physical weight. Down the line, Wyatt let out a short, derisive snort. Jackson didn't move, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. Hayes blinked, tapping his data pad as if the screen had malfunctioned. Captain, with respect, Tartarus 9 is a Class V hazard zone. The atmosphere is caustic. The flora is predatory. The survival rate for our Tier 1 operators is 20%. Quinn won't last atmospheric entry. You build lions, Lieutenant Hayes, Maddox said quietly, leaning down so his mandibles were inches from the liaison's face. Lions are magnificent. They rule the plains. But when the climate shifts, when the sky burns and the water turns to ash, the lions die. Maddox stood up, gesturing to Tobias. I am going into the ash. I do not need a lion. I need a cockroach. Tobias rubbed the back of his neck, suppressing a cough. Do I get hazard pay for the ash? Maddox's mandibles clicked in what a Kralian might consider a smile. If you live to collect it, Quinn. The dropship Iron Coffin lived up to its unofficial moniker. It was a stripped-down angular wedge of a blade of armor and oversized thrusters, designed to punch through hostile atmospheres, dump its cargo, and rocket back to orbit before planetary defense systems could lock on. There were no windows. The interior was lit by sickly red emergency strips. Jackson, Cole, Wyatt, and Tobias were strapped into acceleration couches along the port wall. Maddox stood at the front, anchored to the deck plates by magnetic locks built into his boots. The ship rattled violently as it detached from the orbital station. Jackson laughed, a booming sound that vibrated over the roar of the engines. He slammed a massive fist against his chest plate. Hear that? That's the sound of the void getting out of our way. You boys ready to stack bodies? Just point me at the target, Heavy, Cole replied smoothly. He was running a diagnostic on his customized plasma rifle. The holographic readouts reflecting off his retinas. In and out, standard recon. We tag the Krelian listening post, plant the beacon, and dust off. Wyatt cracked his knuckles. I heard the local fauna is aggressive. Some kind of silicon-based predators. Think they bleed? Everything bleeds if you hit it hard. Enough, Jackson sneered. At the end of the row, Tobias Quinn sat in absolute silence. He hadn't bothered to participate in the pre-drop bravado. His heavy helmet was resting in his lap. Instead of checking his weapons, he was field stripping his life support module. Maddox watched him closely. Tobias's fingers moved with mechanical precision. He popped the casing off the rebreather unit, bypassing the primary sensor with a short length of copper wire he had pulled from his pocket. He then wrapped the joint in a thick layer of gray sealing tape. He didn't look at the holographic diagnostics. He listened to the hum of the internal fan, tilting his head slightly, adjusting a microscopic dial until the pitch smoothed out. What are you doing, Quinn? Jackson called out, his voice laced with contempt. Ship's armorer already verified that gear. You're going to void the warranty. Tobias didn't look up. He slid the casing back into place until it locked with a satisfying click. Armorer checked it in a pressurized bay with perfect humidity. Factory settings are calibrated for standard atmospheres. Tardrus 9 is 90% corrosive fog. The intake valve on these models sticks when the ambient humidity passes 80%. You breathe that fog. Your lungs turned to soup. Jackson frowned, glancing down at his own pristine life support module. The manual says the scrubber handles up to 95%. The manual was written by a guy in an office on Earth who's never choked on ammonia, Tobias muttered, picking up his helmet and inspecting the rubber seals around the collar. Cole chuckled. Relax, Jackson. The dirt scratcher is just paranoid. That's what happens when You spend your life hiding in a hole. Tobias finally looked up. His eyes were flat, devoid of anger. Yeah, it is. The ship suddenly bucked, gravity slamming them back into their couches as the thrusters fired for atmospheric entry. The red lights flickered, died, and then flared back to life. The temperature in the cabin began to rise immediately. The sound of friction against the hull was a deafening scream like tearing metal. Maddox leaned against the force, his voice cutting through the comms channel built into their suits. Listen well, Terran. Tardrus 9 is not a war zone. It is a meat grinder. The local insurgents have seeded the upper atmosphere with EMP spores, organic countermeasures. Your technology will fail. Your shields will drain. You will rely on your training. Let them come. Wyatt shouted over the roar, grinning fiercely. Tobias quietly slipped his helmet over his head. The locking ring engaged. He hit the manual override for his suit's internal comms, isolating his feed. He took a slow, deep breath, tasting the slightly stale, tiny air of his modified scrubber. It tasted like Ceres. It tasted like survival. Captain Tobias's voice cracked over the private channel to Maddox. Maddox blinked his inner eyelids. Speak, Quinn, the pilot. He's coming in. Too steep. We hit the spore cloud at this angle. The friction heat is going to bake the ablative plating before we even reach the canopy. The ship's frame won't hold. Maddox checked the telemetry on his wrist comp. The human was right. The angle of descent was aggressive. Standard for a hot drop, but against biological countermeasures, it was reckless. The pilot is following standard evasion protocols. Standard protocols get you killed when the variables change, Tobias said flatly. Tell him to shallow out by 4 degrees. Take the heat off the belly plates. Otherwise, we don't land. We scatter. Maddox hesitated. Trusting a grunt, a minor no less, over a trained combat pilot, went against every tenet of military doctrine. But Maddox had survived a long time by knowing when doctrine was flawed. He keyed his comms to the cockpit. Pilot, adjust descent angle. Shallow out 4 degrees now, sir. That puts us in the cloud longer. Do it. The ship groaned. The deck plates vibrating so violently the bolts began to rattle. The trajectory shifted. The screaming friction outside dropped a fraction of a decibel. And then they hit the spore cloud. It wasn't a blast. It was a wave of absolute crushing silence. The overhead lights shattered simultaneously in a shower of sparks. The hum of the ship's internal grav plating died. Weightlessness seized them for a terrifying second before gravity reasserted itself with brutal force. On the comms, the pilot started screaming. Main power is down. Auxiliaries are fried. I have no stick. I have no stick. Brace. Maddox roared. Jackson, Cole, and Wyatt gripped their harnesses, their faces pale in the sudden gloom. They braced their massive frames, relying on their dense musculature to absorb the incoming kinetic shock. Tobias didn't brace. He went completely limp. He exhaled all the air from his lungs, let his chin drop to his chest, and allowed his body to become dead weight against the straps. The iron coffin slammed into the canopy of Tardius 9. The impact was a localized earthquake. The dropship didn't just crash. It tore through a mile of dense alien foliage, snapping trees the size of skyscrapers before plowing into the muddy, acidic swamp below. The hole screamed as it deformed, the port side caving inward. Inside the cabin, chaos reigned. Smoke filled the air thick and acrid. Sparks rained down from shredded wiring. The emergency harnesses automatically released, dropping the crew to the tilted floor. Jackson groaned, pushing himself up off the deck. He had a massive bruise forming across his forehead where his helmet had slammed into the cage, but snorts, his heavy-worlder physiology, kept his bones intact. He ripped his helmet off, coughing violently as the cabin filled with smoke. Status. Maddox barked, pulling himself out of the wreckage of his magnetic anchors. His cranian armor was dented, but he moved with terrifying speed. "I'm good," Jackson rumbled, shaking his head. "My leg is pinned." Cole gritted. Out. He was trapped under a collapsed section of the bulkhead. Wyatt was already moving, his massive hands grabbing the steel beam, crushing Cole's leg. With a roar of effort, veins bulging in his neck, the brawler heaved. The metal groaned, shifted, and Cole dragged himself free, panting heavily. "We need to get out," Jackson commanded, taking charge by sheer physical presence. He waded toward the main exit hatch. The locking mechanism was melted shut from an electrical fire. Jackson stepped back, raised his armored boot, and kicked the hatch with enough force to shatter a bank vault. "Stop!" Tobias's voice crackled through the external speakers of his helmet. He was standing near the rear of the cabin, perfectly balanced on the slanted floor. His suit was fully sealed. He was holding a small atmospheric scanner he had scavenged from the ruined wall panel. Hatches jammed. "Quinn. We're sitting ducks in here," Jackson growled, drawing back for another kick. "The external pressure is higher than internal," Tobias said rapidly, stepping forward. "And the atmosphere is 50% caustic ammonia. If you breach that door violently, the pressure differential is going to suck that fog in here like a vacuum." "You aren't wearing your helmet," Jackson sneered. "I can hold my breath. Get your lid on, Wyatt." He kicked the door again. The heavy steel groaned and the hinges snapped. The hatch blew outward. Tobias was right. The pressure difference was immediate and violent. A wall of thick, yellowish-green fog ripped into the cabin. It hissed as it touched the hot metal of the crashed ship. Jackson took a deep breath before the fog hit him, locking his jaw. Wyatt scrambled for his helmet, but he fumbled it. The fog washed over him. Wyatt gasped in surprise, inhaling a lungful of the Tartarus 9 atmosphere. The effect was instantaneous. Wyatt dropped his helmet. He grabbed his throat, his eyes wide with a terror that physical strength couldn't fight. The ammonia stripped the lining of his lungs. In seconds, he fell to his knees, violently convulsing, coughing up a mixture of blood and liquefied tissue. Wyatt! Cole yelled, stumbling forward. His suit fully sealed. Jackson, still holding his breath, grabbed Wyatt by the collar and dragged him toward the open hatch, intending to get him outside, thinking fresh air would help. But there was no fresh air, only the fog. Tobias walked over to the struggling group. He didn't rush. Rushing wasted oxygen. Rushing caused mistakes. He reached down and grabbed Jackson's shoulder, pulling him back. Jackson turned furious, his face turning purple from holding his breath. He swung a massive fist at Tobias. Tobias simply stepped back, letting the heavy worlder's momentum carry him off balance on the slick floor. Tobias pointed at Jackson's helmet lying on the floor, then pointed at the door. Jackson understood. He scooped up his helmet, jamming it onto his head and twisting the lock. He took a desperate gasping breath of his suit's recycled air. On the floor, Wyatt stopped moving. The brawler, who had survived 50 death matches in the pits of Reach, had drowned on dry land in less than a minute. Jackson stared at the body, his broad chest heaving. He just inhaled. I told you. Tobias's voice filtered through the comms, cold and detached. This isn't a war zone. You can't punch the air. Maddox stepped over Wyatt's body, his 4 eyes narrowing as they adjusted to the dense fog outside. The shattered hatch. We are exposed. The crash will draw the local fauna, and the insurgents know exactly where we fell. Move out, Cole. Can you walk? Suit pumped me full of painkillers, Cole said, limping slightly but gripping his rifle tight. I can move. They stepped out of the iron coffin and into the verdant hell. The jungle was massive. Trees with trunks the size of orbital elevators vanished into the swirling yellow fog. Above, the ground was spongy, covered in a thick layer of blue moss that hissed and secreted a thin acidic slime when stepped on. The air was thick, heavy, and hot. Visibility is less than 20 m, Cole reported, peering through his weapons. Thermal sights. Thermal is useless. The ambient temperature matches body heat. It's a total wash. Standard formation, Jackson ordered. Taking point. His massive frame pushed through the dense brush like a bulldozer. We push north toward the objective. 2 clicks. We hit the listening post, plant the beacon. We bunker down and wait for extraction. Hold up, Tobias said. He was kneeling by the exit ramp of the ship, scraping some of the blue moss into a sample vial. We don't have time to play scientist. Dirt scratcher, Jackson snapped. Look at your boots, heavy, Tobias replied, without looking up. Jackson frowned. Looking down. The thick reinforced Rubber soles of his combat boots were smoking. The acidic slime from the moss was slowly eating through the treads. Damn it, Cole muttered, checking his own boots. Same thing. The manual said our gear was resistant to Class V corrosives, Jackson said, a hint of panic edging into his voice. The manual is wrong, Tobias said. Standing up. He reached into his utility pouch and pulled out 3 rolls of heavy-duty polymer weave duct tape. The same tape he used to patch micro fractures in the series mines. He tossed 1 roll to Cole, 1 to Jackson, and kept 1 for himself. Wrap your boots. 2 layers, sole and sides. It won't stop it forever, but the polymer won't react to the acid like the rubber compound does. You'll get a few miles out of it. Maddox watched the human from the shadows of his cowl. The massive soldiers, the pinnacle of Terran engineering, were staring at a roll of duct tape like it was alien technology. Tobias was already wrapping his own boots, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who solved life-threatening problems before breakfast. Wrap them, Maddox ordered. And Quinn. Tobias looked up. You take point. Jackson bristled. Sir, with respect, he's not trained for point. He doesn't know how to track. He doesn't need to track. Maddox buzzed. His voice cold. He needs to keep us from stepping on things that will kill us. Fall in behind him. Tobias didn't argue. He finished taping his boots, slung his standard issue rifle over his shoulder, and walked into the yellow fog. He didn't walk like a soldier. He didn't stalk. He shuffled, keeping his center of gravity low, sweeping his eyes not just across the trean, but across the mud. The bark, the low-hanging vines. They moved in silence for 20 minutes. The jungle was suffocating. The oppressive heat bled through their environmental suits. Suddenly, Cole's comms crackled. My rebreather is redlining. Humidity intake is jammed. Jackson stopped. Slap it. Clear the filter. Cole hit the side of his helmet. The red light inside his visor didn't turn off. It's not clearing. The intake valve is stuck. I'm breathing my own exhaust. Cole started to panic. He reached for the locking ring of his helmet. The suffocating reflex overriding his training. Don't touch that lock, Tobias commanded, his voice suddenly sharp. He closed the distance between them in 3 quick strides. He didn't reach for Cole's helmet. Instead, he drew his combat knife. Hey! Jackson yelled, raising his weapon. Tobias ignored him. He jammed the heavy pommel of the combat knife hard into the recessed intake port on the back of Cole's neck seal. He didn't just hit it. He struck it at a precise upward angle. There was a loud crack followed by the sharp hiss of escaping air and snorts, then the steady rhythmic hum of the internal fan resetting. Cole gasped, falling to his knees as fresh filtered oxygen flooded his helmet. Jesus, Jesus, thank you. Moisture lock, Tobias said, resheathing his knife. The ball bearing inside the valve swells in high humidity. You hit it straight on. You just wedge it tighter. You have to hit it from underneath to unseat it. Jackson lowered his rifle, staring at Tobias. How the hell did you know that? Because, Tobias said, turning back toward the fog. I've had to do it in the dark, 3M underground while holding my breath. Keep moving. We're losing daylight. Maddox fell into step beside Tobias. The alien captain looked down at the miner. You do not fear this place, Maddox observed. Tobias scoffed quietly. Captain, I spent 15 years digging rocks for a corporation that calculated the exact monetary value of my life versus the cost of replacing a broken air scrubber. They decided the scrubber was worth more. TARDIS 9 isn't scary. It's just another rock that wants me dead. The only difference is this one doesn't wear a suit. Maddox chattered his mandibles, a sign of deep respect. Before Maddox could reply, the jungle around them went completely, unnervingly silent. The low drone of the insect-like fauna vanished. Tobias froze. He raised a closed fist. The heavy worlders stopped instantly. Rifles coming up. Discipline taking over. What is it? Jackson whispered over the comms. Vibrations. Tobias said softly. He dropped to one knee, pressing his gloved hand flat against the spongy blue mud. He closed his eyes, tuning out the hum of his suit, the sound of his own breathing. He felt the earth. Something is moving, Tobias said. Something big. Multiple contacts. Underneath us. The mud beneath Jackson's boots suddenly erupted. A geyser of blue mud and shattered roots exploded upward. Jackson didn't even have time to shout. A creature the size of an armored personnel carrier erupted from the soil. Its body a segmented nightmare of slate gray silicon and razor-sharp appendages. It didn't have eyes. It had a gaping circular maw lined with inward curving crystalline teeth. It slammed into Jackson's chest plate like a freight train. The heavy worlder was thrown backward, crashing through the dense underbrush. The beast shrieked, a high-pitched, grinding sound like glass being crushed in a vise. It lunged forward, tracking Jackson perfectly through the thick yellow fog. Contact. Cole yelled, snapping his plasma rifle up and opening fire. Superheated bolts of blue energy slammed into the creature's flank. The silicon carapace absorbed the hits, glowing a dull orange, but the beast didn't stagger. It pivoted with terrifying speed, its blind head snapping toward Cole. Don't shoot! Tobias screamed. Over the comms. He was pressed flat against the trunk of a massive tree. Completely motionless. It's blind. It hunts by vibration and thermal bloom. Your rifle is a beacon. Cole didn't hear him, or he didn't care. Training dictated overwhelming firepower. He held the trigger down, backing away. As the creature charged, the ground beneath Cole buckled. A second beast burst from the earth, its mandibles snapping shut on the barrel of Cole's rifle. The weapon shattered in a shower of sparks and venting plasma. Cole fell backward, desperately scrambling away through the acidic mud. Maddox moved. The Kralian captain didn't. Use a rifle. He drew a heavy, kinetically charged halberd from his back. He vaulted over a fallen log, closing the distance to the second beast. In a blur of gray armor, the halberd sparked with energy as Maddox drove it straight down into the joint between the creature's armored segments. The beast thrashed violently, spraying a caustic clear fluid from the wound. Maddox held his ground, his boots digging into the muck, twisting the blade to sever the creature's central nerve cluster. The monster collapsed, twitching. Jackson! Cole shouted, pulling his sidearm. 50 yards away. Jackson was locked in a brutal wrestling match with the first beast. The heavy worlder was incredibly strong, holding the snapping inches from his helmet, but his boots were sliding in the mud. The creature was pushing him toward a trench of deep bubbling acid. Shoot it! Jackson roared, his voice straining. Tobias unslung his rifle, but he didn't aim at the beast crushing Jackson. He looked around the clearing. He analyzed the muddy terrain, the root systems, the density of the earth. He reached into his utility pouch and pulled out a high-yield breaching charge. Captain! Tobias yelled, keying his private channel to Maddox. Keep them still. Tell Cole to stop moving. Maddox didn't hesitate. Cole, freeze. Absolute stillness. Cole froze, his sidearm trembling in his hands. Tobias primed the breaching charge, setting the timer for 5 seconds. He didn't throw it at the monster. He threw it in the opposite direction, hurling it as far as he could into a thick cluster of hollow-looking, calcified trees. He dropped to his stomach and buried his face in his arms. Brace! The charge detonated. It wasn't a standard explosive. It was a concussive shockwave designed to blow through reinforced bunker doors. The explosion slammed into the hollow trees, amplifying the shock wave into the ground. The earth rolled beneath them. The beast on top of Jackson froze. Its entire sensory apparatus was overloaded by the massive localized seismic event. It abandoned the heavy worlder instantly, whipping its massive frame around and burrowing into the earth with terrifying speed, surging toward the source of the explosion. Silence slammed back down on the jungle, broken only by the hiss of rain and Jackson's ragged breathing. Tobias stood up, brushing acidic blue slime off his suit. He walked over to Jackson. The heavy worlder was lying on his back. His chest plate was deeply gouged. The ceramic armor cracked down the middle. Blood was pooling beneath his right leg. One of the creature's scythe-like appendages had punched clean through the armor on his thigh. Jackson gritted his teeth, his face pale. Behind his visor, it had just came out of nowhere. Their tremor sense. Predators, Tobias said flatly, kneeling beside Jackson and pulling a medical stapler from his kit. Mining colonies on Eden Prime have similar fauna. You walk heavy, you shoot heavy, you ring the dinner bell. Hold still. Tobias jammed the stapler into the wound, injecting a mix of Coagulants and biofoam. Jackson hissed in pain, but didn't move. Cole limped over, staring at the crater where the first beast had disappeared. You threw the charge the wrong way. I threw it where I wanted the bug to go, Tobias corrected. He wrapped a field dressing tightly around Jackson's leg. You shoot it, it bleeds. Its blood is likely an alarm pheromone. You kill one, you draw the hive. You distract it, it chases ghosts. Maddox wrenched his Hallard free from the dead beast. He wiped the glowing blade on a clump of moss. He looked at Jackson's leg, then at Cole's shattered rifle. Can you walk heavy? Maddox asked. Jackson tested his weight, wincing violently. Yeah, I can walk. Just a little slower. Slower is better, Tobias said, standing up. Tread light, heel to toe. Slide your feet. Don't stomp. You want to survive this jungle, you have to stop acting like you own it. Maddox looked at the human. Minor. The doctrine of the coalition forces was dominance. Superior firepower. Superior strength, superior will. Tobias Quinn possessed none of these. He survived by submission. He survived by understanding the machine of the environment and carefully stepping between the gears. Take point, Quinn, Maddox ordered. Jackson didn't argue this time. The heavy worlder was lying on his back. His chest plate was deeply gouged. The ceramic armor cracked down the middle. Blood was pooling beneath his right leg. One of the creature's scythe-like appendages had punched clean through the armor on his thigh. Jackson gritted his teeth, his face pale. Behind his visor, it had just came out of nowhere. Their tremor sense. Predators, Tobias said flatly, kneeling beside Jackson and pulling a medical stapler from his kit. Mining colonies on Eden Prime have similar fauna. You walk heavy, you shoot heavy, you ring the dinner bell. Hold still. Tobias jammed the stapler into the wound, injecting a mix of coagulants and biofoam. Jackson hissed in pain, but didn't move. Cole limped over, staring at the crater where the first beast had disappeared. You threw the charge the wrong way. I threw it where I wanted the bug to go. Tobias corrected. He wrapped a field dressing tightly around Jackson's leg. You shoot it, it bleeds. Its blood is likely an alarm pheromone. You kill one, you draw the hive. You distract it, it chases ghosts. Maddox wrenched his Hallard free from the dead beast. He wiped the glowing blade on a clump of moss. He looked at Jackson's leg, then at Cole's shattered rifle. Can you walk heavy? Maddox asked. Jackson tested his weight, wincing violently. Yeah, I can walk. Just a little slower. Slower is better, Tobias said, standing up. Tread light, heel to toe. Slide your feet. Don't stomp. You want to survive this jungle, you have to stop acting like you own it. Maddox looked at the human. Minor. The doctrine of the coalition forces was dominance. Superior firepower. Superior strength, superior will. Tobias Quinn possessed none of these. He survived by submission. He survived by understanding the machine of the environment and carefully stepping between the gears. Take point, Quinn, Maddox ordered. Jackson didn't argue this time. He just leaned on Cole and they followed the miner deeper into the fog. The listening post was a brutalist slab of plastal and concrete shoved into the side of a sheer jagged cliff. It looked less like a military installation and more like a tombstone, marking the edge of a dying world. The heavy blast doors were sealed tight. Thick layers of aggressive thorny vines had grown over the sensor arrays, blinding the facility. No thermal signatures, Cole whispered, checking a handheld scanner. No electromagnetic bleed. The power core is completely dead. The insurgents must have hit it hard, Jackson muttered, heavily favoring his uninjured leg. Tobias walked up to the heavy blast door. He ran a gloved hand along the seam. No blast marks, no plasma scoring. The door wasn't breached from the outside. He wiped away a layer of corrosive grime near the locking mechanism. The manual override panel had been ripped off. The wires inside fused into a melted clump. They locked it from the inside, Tobias noted, and then destroyed the panel so no one could get in or get out. Maddox stepped forward, his massive frame dwarfing the humans. Cole override the secondary locks. Cole moved to the door, pulling a small slicing tool from his belt. He connected the leads to the rusted interface port. It took 10 agonizing minutes of standing in the acidic rain, but finally heavy internal bolts groaned. The blast door slid open a fraction, sticking on warped rails, leaving a gap just wide enough to squeeze through. The air that rushed out of the gap wasn't stale. It was rancid. Tobias checked his environmental readouts. Atmosphere inside is toxic. Same concentration of ammonia as outside, but heavily saturated with decaying organic matter. Keep your seals tight. They slipped through the gap one by one. The interior of the bunker was pitch black. The beams of their shoulder-mounted flashlights cut through a thick floating haze of spores and dust. The corridor was a scene of silent horror. 6 Crayon operators lay scattered across the floor. They were fully armored, their weapons still gripped tightly in their claws. There were no signs of a firefight, no bullet holes, no blood. Jackson nudged one of the bodies with his boot. What the hell killed them? Poison gas. Tobias knelt beside a terminal. The metal casing was heavily pitted and rusted. He shone his light on the air ventilation grates running along the ceiling. They were completely blocked by a hardened resin-like substance. Not poison, Tobias said softly. Asphyxiation. He stood up and pointed to a massive crack running down the structural wall of the bunker. The facility settled. The foundation cracked. It breached the primary atmospheric seals. The automatic scrubbers kicked into overdrive trying to filter the ammonia leaking in. But the local flora, those spores in the air, got sucked into the intake vents. Tobias walked over to one of the blocked vents and tapped the resin with his combat knife. It was hard as concrete. The spores react to the synthetic filters. They calcify. The ventilation system clogged itself solid in a matter of hours. The air inside went bad. They tried to fix it, realized they couldn't, and sealed the door so the insurgents wouldn't take the outpost. Cole shuddered. They suffocated in the dark. It happens, Tobias said, his voice void of emotion. Beltminer's nightmare. You hear the fan stop and you know you've got about 3 hours to write your will. Maddox walked past the bodies of his kin without stopping. He didn't offer a prayer or a salute. Crenchans viewed the dead as empty vessels. The warrior's spirit had already returned to the void. The command center is on the lower level, Maddox stated, his synthesized voice cutting through the gloom. We find the central console. We plant the beacon. We leave. They descended a cramped, spiraling stairwell. Jackson struggled, his injured leg protesting every step, his heavy armor grinding against the narrow walls. The command center was a circular room, dominated by a massive holographic table. Auxiliary emergency lights flickered weakly, casting long, shifting shadows. Maddox approached the main terminal. He reached into a secure pouch on his chest plate and withdrew a small cylindrical device glowing with a faint pulsing red light. The beacon. Cole watched the device. Captain, I've seen extraction beacons. They ping standard encrypted frequencies. That one is broadcasting a tachyon pulse. That's deep space. Maddox didn't look at the sniper. He slammed the cylinder into the primary interface port. The console lit up, a dozen screens flaring to life, displaying tactical maps of Sector 4. A robotic female voice filled the room. Targeting beacon confirmed. Orbital grid aligned. Awaiting final authorization for Class 9 deployment. Jackson froze. He leaned heavily on the holographic table. Class 9, Captain. A Class 9 deployment is orbital bombardment. Kinetic rods. They're going to glass the entire grid. Yes, Maddox said calmly. Cole stepped back, his hand drifting toward his sidearm. You said this was a recon drop. You said we plant a beacon for the next wave. There is no next wave, Maddox replied, his 4 eyes locking onto the humans. High Command considers Tartarus 9 a sunk cost. The insurgency is too entrenched. The indigenous life is too hostile. But we cannot allow the listening posts data banks to fall into enemy hands. The beacon paints a target for the fleet. In 30 minutes, a kinetic strike will erase this bunker and a 10 miles radius around it. Silence stretched in the dark room. And extraction? Jackson asked, his voice low. Dangerous. The dropship crashed heavy. Tobias chimed in from the back of the room. He was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed. You really think they had a secondary ship waiting for a squad of grunts in a caustic atmosphere? Snorts, we're the targeting lasers. Once the bomb drops, we're ash. Jackson turned to Tobias, his face twisted in rage. You knew? I suspected. Tobias shrugged. Corporations don't send heavyworlders to do a stealth recon mission unless they don't plan on carrying that heavy armor back home. Fuel is expensive. Blood is cheap. Jackson let out a roar of fury. He lunged at Maddox, throwing a massive right hook aimed at the Kralian's head. Maddox didn't even draw a weapon. He stepped inside the heavyworlders' guard, grabbing Jackson's wrist with one hand and driving an armored knee straight into Jackson's wounded leg. Jackson collapsed with a scream, hitting the metal floor hard. Do not mistake me for your enemy, Terran. Maddox growled, standing over Jackson. I am standing in this tomb with you. High Command ordered this operation. They requested my best soldiers. I defied them. Maddox looked at Jackson and Cole. If I had brought the lions, you would have fought your way to this bunker, planted the beacon out of blind loyalty, and stood at attention while the sky fell on you. You would have died as perfectly calibrated weapons. Maddox turned his gaze to Tobias. The miner stared back, his expression entirely unreadable. But I did not bring only lions, Maddox said. I brought a man who knows how to survive in a collapsed tunnel. I brought a cockroach. Maddox pointed a long gray claw at Tobias. You have 30 minutes, Quinn. The blast doors are sealed. The air is toxic. The fleet is warming up their cannons. Figure a way out or we burn together. Tobias didn't panic. Panic burned oxygen. Panic made your hands shake. He simply pushed off the wall and walked over to the command console. He bypassed the flashing red orbital targeting warning and pulled up the bunker's architectural schematics. Cole, Tobias said, his voice entirely detached from the reality of their impending death. Check the motion sensors on the perimeter cameras. Snorts. See if the power spike from the beacon woke them up. Cole hesitated, still staring at Maddox. But training took over. He limped to a secondary terminal. Cameras are blind from the vines, but seismic sensors are online. Wait. Cole tapped a key. We've got movement, a lot of it, outside the blast doors. Insurgents, Maddox said. They tracked the drop ship's trajectory. They have come to claim the bunker. They're setting up thermal cutters, Cole reported, his voice tightening. They're going to breach the main door in 10 minutes. Jackson groaned from the floor, clutching his bleeding leg. So, we either get shot by the rebels or vaporized by the fleet. Hell of a choice. We aren't doing either, Tobias said. He traced a glowing blue line on the holographic schematic. This bunker was built into the cliff. The foundation cracked, which means the rear wall abuts natural cave systems. The engineers routed the primary exhaust vents for the fusion generator straight through the rock to vent heat away from the thermal scanners. The generator is dead, Maddox observed. The generator is dead, but the exhaust shafts are still there, Tobias corrected. He tapped the map. Shaft 3 is wide enough for a man. It leads up through the cliff face, coming Out 2 m north of the blast zone. We climb it. We get clear of the kinetic strike, and we vanish into the jungle. One problem, dirt scratcher, Jackson grunted, pulling himself up to sit against the console. You saw the vents upstairs. The spores calcified the system. That shaft will be plugged solid with 50 feet of resin. Tobias looked at the heavy worlder. I know we're going to blow it out. He turned to Maddox. Captain, your armor has a localized atmospheric overpressurization system, right? 4 underwater deployments. It does, Maddox confirmed. Good. Cole, I need the power cell from your shattered rifle. Jackson, I need the emergency oxygen tank from your suit. Give me your combat knives. All of them. For the first time since the drop, no one argued with the miner. Jackson unclipped his secondary O2 canister and tossed it. Cole handed over a glowing cracked plasma cell. Tobias moved with terrifying efficiency. He was no longer a reluctant conscript. He was a master craftsman in his element. He knelt on the floor, stripping the casing off the plasma cell to expose the raw, volatile core. He duct taped the core directly to the nozzle of the highly pressurized oxygen canister. What are you building? Cole asked, taking a step back. A thermomoric directional charge, Tobias muttered, using his teeth to strip a wire. The heavy worlders like standard explosives. Boom. Everything goes out in a circle. In a mine, a circular explosion brings the roof down on your head. You need the blast to push in one direction up. He packed the explosive construct into an empty metal ammunition crate, then surrounded it tightly with the heavy kinetically charged combat knives, pointing them upward like arrowheads. The insurgents are through the first layer of the blast door, Cole warned, looking at the monitors. 5 minutes. 22 minutes until orbital strike, the automated voice droned. Time to go, Tobias said, hoisting the heavy metal box onto his shoulder. They left the command center, moving down a narrow maintenance corridor at the back of the bunker. The air here was even worse. Thick with the smell of rust and decaying spores. They reached a massive steel grate, bolted into the floor. Exhaust shaft. 3. Maddox gripped the grate and heaved. Screws shrieked as they sheared out of the metal, and the captain tossed the heavy grate aside. Below was a pitch black vertical tunnel, 30 foot down. The beam of Tobias's flashlight hit a solid wall of pale, hardened resin. The calcified blockage. I need to place the charge directly on the resin plug, Tobias said. Otherwise, the blast will just crack the shaft walls and bury us. I will go, Maddox stated. You're too wide, Captain, Tobias said, strapping the improvised bomb to his chest. Jackson, snorts, is too big. Cole's leg won't let him climb back up in time. It's me. Tobias didn't wait for a debate. He grabbed the rusted maintenance ladder, bolted to the side of the shaft, and began to descend into the darkness. The shaft was incredibly narrow, barely wider than his shoulders. The air was dead, hot, and suffocating. This was the environment that bred him. This was Ceres. He moved down the ladder with mechanical precision, counting the rungs. He reached the blockage. The resin was slick and hard as steel. He wedged the metal box against the wall, taping it securely to the ladder, so the knives were pointed straight down into the plug. He set the timer for 3 minutes. Charge set. Tobias rasped over the comms, starting his climb back up. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the bunker above. The concrete walls of the shaft shuddered violently. Dust rained down on Tobias, blinding him. They breached the main door, Cole yelled over the radio, the sound of plasma fire echoing in the background. Insurgents are inside. We're taking heavy fire. Hold them off. Maddox roared. Tobias climbed faster, his lungs burning. The physical exertion in the compromised suit was pushing his heart rate into the red zone. He was 10 feet from the top when the rusted ladder gave way. With a sickening crack, the bolts holding the ladder to the concrete wall sheared off. Tobias fell backward, dropping 10 feet. Before his safety tether, a length of industrial wire he had clipped to a higher rung snapped taut. The breath was violently driven from his lungs. He swung into the concrete wall, his helmet cracking against the stone. Quinn. Jackson's voice came through the static. Tobias gasped, trying to pull himself up the wire. His snorts. Hands were shaking, his vision blurred. He looked down. The digital timer on the improvised charge was glowing red in the dark. 60 seconds. Ladder's gone. Tobias managed to choke out. Above him, the firefight was deafening. He could hear the heavy, concussive blasts of insurgent weaponry tearing the maintenance corridor apart. Maddox's face appeared at the rim of the shaft, his 4 eyes glowing in the dark. The captain reached down, extending his long armored arm as far as he could. He was still 5 foot short of Tobias. Reach, human, Maddox commanded. I can't, Tobias said, feeling the strength drain from his arms. The wire was slipping. Get clear of the shaft. When that thing blows, it's going to act like a chimney. The fire is coming up. I do not leave my assets behind, Maddox growled, bracing his boots against the lip of the shaft and leaning perilously far over the edge. 30 seconds. Tobias looked up at the alien captain. For 15 years, he had been a number on a corporate ledger, a disposable asset. When a tunnel collapsed on Ceres, they didn't send rescue teams. They sent replacement crews. Captain, Tobias whispered. Blow the atmospheric over pressure. Maddox froze. Do it. Tobias yelled. Aim it down. Maddox understood. The Kralian captain aimed his chest plate directly down the shaft. He hit the manual override for his suits. Underwater pressure systems. A massive, concussive wave of compressed air blasted out of Maddox's armor, shooting straight down the narrow tube. The sheer kinetic force of the air hit Tobias, swinging him violently upward on His tether. Tobias reached out. Maddox's claw snapped shut around Tobias's wrist. With bone-bruising force. The captain hauled backward, ripping the human out of the shaft and throwing him onto the metal floor of the corridor just as the timer hit 0. Down, Maddox roared. They threw themselves flat. Deep in the earth, the thermomoric charge detonated. The sound wasn't a bang. It was a physical blow. The plasma core ignited the pure oxygen, creating a directed spear of white-hot hellfire. The explosive force hit the calcified resin, shattering it instantly. But Tobias was right. The shaft acted like a chimney. A geyser of fire and pulverized resin blasted up through the open grate. A pillar of flame that scorched the ceiling and sucked all the oxygen out of the corridor. The heat was unbearable. The warning alarms in Tobias's suit screamed. And then a cold, rancid wind blew up from the darkness. The plug was gone. The shaft was open. At the end of the corridor, the blast doors to the command center blew open. A dozen insurgents clad in heavy spiked indigenous armor poured into the hallway, raising their weapons. Go! Maddox ordered, shoving Cole and Jackson toward the open shaft. Drop. It's a slide now. Jackson didn't hesitate. The heavy worlder jumped into the black void of the shaft, sliding down the smooth, scorched rock. Cole followed instantly. Tobias rolled toward the edge. He looked back. Maddox was standing perfectly still in the center of the hallway, his halberd drawn, facing the charging insurgents. Captain! Tobias yelled. Maddox didn't turn around. You found the door, Quinn. Now I will close it. No. Tobias scrambled to his feet. An insurgent fired. A heavy kinetic slug slammed into Maddox's shoulder, spinning the massive alien around. Maddox roared, charging forward to meet them. Tobias didn't think. He didn't calculate survival odds. He grabbed a heavy thermite grenade from Cole's discarded web gear, pulled the pin, and threw it not at the insurgents, but directly at the ceiling support beams above Maddox. The grenade detonated in a blinding flash of white sparks. The structural integrity of the ceiling, already compromised by the cracked foundation and the recent blast, completely failed. Thousands of pounds of concrete, rock, and steel collapsed downward in an avalanche of debris, instantly crushing the front line of insurgents and creating an impenetrable wall of rubble between the surviving enemies and the escape shaft. The shock wave knocked Maddox backward, sending him sliding toward the edge of the pit. Tobias grabbed the Krillian's heavy armor, hauling him toward the shaft. Nobody dies for a corporation today, Captain. Move. They threw themselves into the abyss just as the automated voice echoed through the ruined bunker above them. Orbital strike inbound. Impact in 3, 2, 1. The slide down the exhaust shaft was a bruising, terrifying plunge into absolute darkness. Tobias hit the sides. His armored suit scraping against the scorched stone. Friction burning through his undersuit. Above them, the world ended. The kinetic strike did not make a sound. It was simply a physical erasure. A tungsten rod dropped from orbit slammed into the listening post with the force of a tactical nuke. Deep underground, the shockwave caught them. The rock tube warped. Gravity seemed to invert for a sickening second. And then the sides of the shaft shattered. Tobias was thrown out of the tunnel, tumbling through open air before slamming into a deep pool of frigid, stagnant water. He breached the surface, gasping. The water was heavily mineralized, tasting of copper and sulfur. Pitch blackness pressed against his visor. He slapped the side of his helmet. His shoulder-mounted flashlight flickered, buzzed, and died. "Comms check, Tobias," rasped, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Static. Then a wet cough. "Alive." Cole groaned. From somewhere to his left, a dim green chemical light snapped, casting a sickly glow over the subterranean lake. Cole was dragging himself onto a rocky shoreline, his armor dented and covered in ash. A heavy splash echoed to the right. Jackson broke the surface, thrashing wildly. The heavy worlder's massive frame was sinking. His armor was compromised, filling with water, and his wounded leg was completely useless. Maddox rose from the water beside Jackson like a prehistoric leviathan. The Krayian captain grabbed the heavy worlder by the collar plating and hauled him toward the shore with raw, brutal strength. Maddox collapsed on the rocks, his four lungs heaving. A thick, viscous blue fluid was leaking from the joints of his chest plate. Crayon blood. The insurgent's kinetic slug had done deep internal damage. Tobias waded ashore, pulling himself onto the slick black stone. He unsealed his helmet, trusting the cave air over the failing scrubbers. In his suit, the air was cold, damp, and smelled of wet dust, but it was breathable. Jackson lay on his back, shivering violently. He looked down at his leg. The field dressing was gone. The acidic mud and the bacteria of the jungle had gotten into the deep puncture wound. The flesh around the tear was necrotic, spiderwebbed with angry black veins. Biofoam is failing. Jackson gritted out, his teeth chattering. Suit says I have severe sepsis. Heart rate is dropping. Cole knelt beside him, holding the green chem light. The sniper's hands were shaking. He looked at Tobias, the arrogance entirely stripped from his face. Fix him, Quinn. You fixed the air. You fixed the door. Fix him. Tobias looked at the wound. He looked at the heavy worlder's pale, sweat-drenched face. He had seen this look in the mines. He had seen men crushed by rockfalls, waiting for a medevac that was hours away, realizing the math of their own survival didn't add up. I can't, Tobias said quietly. I can patch a machine. I can't patch dead tissue. Jackson closed his eyes. He didn't scream. He didn't rage. The fight just slowly drained out of him. The Invincible heavyworlder bred for dominance, defeated by microscopic bacteria. Leave me the sidearm, Cole. Jackson whispered. Jackson, no. We can carry you. You can't carry dead weight in the dark. Jackson interrupted, his voice weak but firm. He opened his eyes and looked at Tobias. You were right, dirt scratcher. We didn't own the jungle. We were just passing through. Tobias reached down and unholstered Jackson's sidearm. He checked the charge, set it on the rock next to Jackson's hand, and turned away. In the mines, you didn't drag the dead. You saved the living. Move out. Maddox commanded, his voice a strained, synthesized buzz. We are 2 miles from the extraction coordinates. The drone will not wait. They left Jackson in the dark. A single muffled shot echoed through the cave system 5 minutes later. No one looked back. The subterranean world of Tardius 9 was a labyrinth of razor-sharp shale and bottomless chasms. Without thermal optics, Cole was blind. Without his halberd, which had been lost in the fall, Maddox was unarmed and bleeding out. Tobias led them. He moved through the absolute darkness with an eerie grace. He felt the minute changes in air pressure. He smelled the ozone that indicated a dead end and the faint trace of surface sulfur that meant an updraft. He navigated the void the way a sailor navigates the sea. 3 hours passed. The cold seeped into their bones. Cole began to stumble. Without his emergency oxygen tank, the one Tobias had used to blow the shaft, the sniper suit was relying on the ambient air of the caves. The air was breathable but thin, lacking the heavy oxygen concentration human physiology required for sustained exertion. Quinn Cole gasped, leaning against a sheer rock wall. I can't catch my breath. Tobias stopped and walked back to the sniper. He checked the digital readout on Cole's wrist. The numbers were plunging. Hypoxia. Your red blood cell count can't process the thin atmosphere, Tobias said flatly. Your heavy world genetics demand high oxygen. You're suffocating on dry land. Give me your tank. Cole begged, grabbing Tobias's arm. Just a hit, just to clear my head. My tank is integrated into the suit's primary frame, Tobias replied, gently removing Cole's hand. If I take it out, we both breathe the cave air. And I'm the only one who knows how to find the surface. Cole stared at him, terror widening his eyes. You're going to let me die down here? You are dying down here, Cole. The surface is still a mile up. You won't make the climb. Tobias didn't say it with malice. He said it with the terrifying pragmatic detachment of a survivor. Cole slumped against the wall, sliding down to the rock floor. He looked at Maddox. The alien captain was leaning heavily against a stalagmite. His blue blood pooling at his feet, his breathing a wet, ragged rattle. He's dying, too, Cole choked out. Why does he get to walk? Because he hasn't asked me to stop, Tobias said. Cole didn't speak again. The hypoxia took him. Quietly. His eyes fluttered shut, his chin dropped to his chest, and he simply slipped into unconsciousness and then into death. The perfectly calibrated weapon starved of the very fuel it needed to burn. Tobias picked up Cole's remaining chainmite. He turned to Maddox. The Cryan captain was swaying on his feet. The internal bleeding was massive. I cannot climb, human. Maddox buzzed. You don't have to, Tobias said, pointing the green light upward. We're here. Above them, a narrow fissure in the cavern roof let in a tiny gray sliver of light, the surface. Tobias found a series of jagged handholds in the rock face. He began to climb. He didn't look down. He focused on the stone, on his grip, on the rhythm of his breathing. He reached the fissure, squeezed his narrow shoulders through the gap, and pulled himself out into the ash. He reached back down the hole. Captain, take my hand. Maddox stood at the bottom of the fissure. He looked up at the human. He looked at the outstretched hand of the weak, stooped, sickly miner from Siri, sir. Maddox reached up, but not to take Tobias's hand. The captain unclasped the heavy segmented command insignia from his chest plate. He tossed it upward. It landed in the ash near Tobias's boots. The extraction drone is calibrated for one heavy worlder, Maddox said, his voice fading into static. With my weight, it will not achieve escape velocity. The math is simple, Quinn. Tobias looked down at the alien. Corporations do math, Captain. We dig. I am done digging, Tobias, Maddox said. It was the first time he had used the human's first name. The Kralian sat down on the cold stone, crossing his four legs, preparing his spirit for the void. Tell High Command. The lions failed. The cockroach lived. Maddox reached up and severed his suit's primary power cable. His armor went dark. Tobias stood up. The landscape of Tartarus 9 was gone. The kinetic strike had vaporized the jungle, leaving behind a massive shallow crater of gray ash and fused black glass. The yellow fog had been burned away by the heat of the impact, revealing a dull, rusted sky. A high-pitched whine cut through the silence. Descending from the low orbit clouds was a corporate extraction drone. It was a brutal, ugly piece of machinery. A simple automated pod. Designed to retrieve valuable assets. Not people. Assets. Data drives, rare biological samples, command staff. It landed on the glass with a heavy thud. Its loading ramp dropping open. The interior was the size of a coffin. Tobias walked toward it, his boots crunched softly on the glass. He bent down and picked up Maddox's command insignia, sliding it into his utility pouch. He was exhausted. His lungs burned, his hands trembled. He stepped into the pod. The ramp closed. Asset retrieved. The automated voice chirped happily. Initiating burn 4. Orbital Station Charlie 9. Please secure restraints. Tobias didn't secure the restraints. He sat on the floor of the pod, resting his head against the cold metal bulkhead. When the pod docked at Charlie 9 3 hours later, a full medical team and a corporate debriefing squad were waiting in the hangar. Lieutenant Hayes stood at the front, holding a data pad, waiting to see which of his magnificent heavyworlders had survived the meat grinder. The hatch hissed open. Tobias Quinn stepped out. He looked exactly as he had when he left. Pale, stooped, coughing softly. He walked past the shocked medical team. He walked past the heavily armed guards. Lieutenant Hayes stared at him, his mouth open. "Quinn, where is Captain Maddox? Where is Jackson? Cole, where is the squad?" Tobias stopped. He reached into his pouch, pulled out the heavy Kralian insignia, and tossed it onto Hayes's data pad. It landed with a heavy final clack. "The Lions are dead, Lieutenant," Tobias said, his voice dry and growly. The sky burned. Tobias walked past the liaison, heading toward the maintenance decks. He didn't look back. He had survived the ash. He was ready for his next shift. If you enjoyed this descent into the gritty reality of human survival, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you the best hard-hitting HFY stories every week. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss an upload. What did you think of Tobias's resourcefulness? Would you have survived the drop onto Tardius 9? Let us know in the comments below. Share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans, and as always, keep looking up at the stars.